the school wouldn't give us any numbers for how much outdoor air they are giving the students. It sent monitors to Columbia Elementary, James Clement High, and Mill Creek Elementary. 2 out of those 3 had 2 or 3 times the CO2 accumulation that you'd expect to see in a school that meets code.
Let's talk to Michael Bailey now. Michael Bailey is a local parent here in Huntsville and co-founder of Indoor Air Care Advocates. He's a friend of the show, recurring guest now, talking about an issue that should resonate with all of us, regardless of affiliation, of our politics, of what we think about unions, anything like that. And that is the way the indoor air quality impacts our working conditions, our students' learning conditions, and the ways that government and employers can take effective action for our health and safety. He's been really active in pushing local school systems to make the much needed improvements in this area, and we certainly appreciate his work. Michael, welcome back to the Valley Labor Report.
Thanks so much for the intro. And first things first, I think it's really cool that you mentioned immunocompromised people with comorbidities, and those are real people in our community. I know some. They're not like rare or anything like that. And it's really a compassionate and courageous and important act to make sure we don't leave such people behind. These are our community members. So I wanted to thank you for that. But I also, I want people to know that there are normal people. Well, shucks, that is really a faux pas. But there are people who, a lot of people consider themselves normal if they don't have a comorbidity or an immunocompromised thing. I'm trying to think from the point of view of people who don't experience those parts of life. And so they think of themselves as normal. And so there are normal people who didn't have any, comorbidity fairy come tell them that they've got issues that end up experiencing problems. And there are furthermore normal people, right? People who consider themselves not to have any of these problems, and so they think it's not an issue, who are experiencing problems because of the fact that we are getting sick more often. And it's not just COVID, it actually is the flu. It's also RSV and things like that. And the reason I have anything to say about it at all is because I know there to be solutions. It's clear that we don't have to, quote, live in fear by shutting things down. We can really do something to make it easier for all of us to live productive, happy, long lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so let's start with talking about chronic absenteeism in relation to our students in public schools.
Yeah, for sure. So most schools, including Madison schools, and I count Madison City and Madison County in that, didn't really do much with ventilation after 2020. We just kind of went back to masks optional, and we embraced normalcy. And the ALSDE report card said that Madison City schools' chronic absenteeism in 2021 was less than 3%, which sounds really dreamy. And after the U.S. Department of Education withdrew their COVID-19 reporting waiver, where do you think that chronic absenteeism went? I'll give you a guess. Yeah.
Let's see.
It went this way. Yeah. It doubled in Alabama. And in Madison City schools, it increased by a factor of 2.6. And I informed Dr. Nichols and Madison City Schools Board of Education in June that the measurements that we have show that their schools aren't bringing in even 1/7 of the outdoor air that's supposed to be brought in according to mechanical code. And I explained how that would make kids sick. And he said that, well, if you don't count the period between August and January, which is ridiculous, then, our attendance is 95 or 96%. But I know there to be parents that have been complaining since January and February that their kids are still sick. I know that there was a pylon in a mom's group of like 40 parents that said that their kids were, and I quote, missing so much school, it's insane. And so there's also chronic absenteeism that I think is maybe swallowing up some component of that lack of attendance. I also know a mom whose kid was sick 19 or more days in the school year, and Madison City Schools called her to ask her how they could support her in getting her kid to school more often. And I thought that was really adding insult to injury, because I've been trying to tell them what they ought to do that. Parents need to tell schools, fix your shoddy ventilation and quit costing me in sick time. So yeah, there's also, I really ought to mention this. There's a dad who spoke at Madison City Schools Board of Education meeting, which was captured by I Vote Madison, which in full disclosure, my wife co-runs I Vote Madison. And They recorded a Madison City School Board meeting on the 6th of June where a dad said that he and his 5 kids are sick so often, and several other families, same thing, that they've all gotten together with an attorney because of the undue burden of doctor's notes. Not to be able to keep their kids home like they should. And that guy, whether he knows it or not, is advocating for air quality because of what I'll share with you next. But essentially, they're all experiencing that heightened illness, and they're routinely sending their kids to school sick. And the kids are carrying the weight of the school that didn't do anything with ventilation and still isn't meeting code. And by the way, if anybody knows that person, please contact Indoor Air Care Advocates. It's indooraircareadvocates@gmail.com. We would really like to connect with that father.
So yeah, tell us what you've learned about Madison City schools in particular, but also in general about your research with local school districts and air quality and like who's up to code basically.
Absolutely. So we learned that Madison City Schools thought they could use a technology called ionization to stand in for some amount of ventilation in some schools. Do you know what ionization is?
No, not really. I've heard of it, but I have no clue what that is.
Neither did I. I was following all these experts and they're like, you should ventilate, you should filter. And I had never seen one say, you should ionize. So we looked into it. And the way it's supposed to work is that ions are pushed into the breathing zone. And in that breathing zone ventilation, those ions are supposedly going to increase the particle mass and drag those particles to the ground or make them stick to the wall through a process that those vendors call agglomeration. But the EPA and Boeing, even right here in Huntsville Labs, concluded that that doesn't contribute significantly to disinfection or pulling particles out of the air. And even the disclaimer on the website for one of those vendors expressly says it's not intended to prevent infections. And furthermore, there are chemists at UC Boulder and elsewhere who say if you add ions to indoor air, the things that already are in indoor air, like paint fumes and carpeting fibers and other things, can partially decompose and add unanticipated byproducts to the air. So it's kind of like a little science experiment. And that's why I think that the Bloomberg School of Public Health really put it best when they said the primary aim for air quality improvement should remain removing contaminants from the air and not introducing new substances to the air. And I firmly believe that. So because they're using ionization, what proportion of outdoor air would you guess that they're cutting out and not giving to students?
At this point now, I'm starting to think none.
It's actually, you're onto something almost. The school wouldn't give us any numbers for how much outdoor air they are giving to students, and it's maybe because they don't have the tools to measure it. I'm not really sure, but we took matters into our own hands, literally. We gave some carbon dioxide monitors like this device that I'm showing you to occupants who go to those schools, not specifying what kind of occupants, just to keep it vague here. But
right.
We sent these monitors to Columbia Elementary, James Clemens High, and Mill Creek Elementary, and we confirmed that 2 out of those 3 had CO2 accumulation that climbed past 2 or 3 times the amount that you'd expect to see in a school that meets code. And that's based on a figure from the Division of Construction Management. They said, if you're meeting code, the number on this little screen ought not exceed 1,200 generally. Just, I'm paraphrasing, that's a rule of thumb, but that's
Sure.
roughly what it shouldn't exceed. And in one school, the number was as high as 3,700. Now, CO2 isn't going to hurt anybody necessarily at those levels. That's not the thing we're worried about. What it means, though, is that the air that students are exhaling, they're making stale air. They're consuming the fresh air and exhaling, and there's nothing replacing it with clean air. And so whereas in a room that meets code, you could expect to breathe only about 1% to 2% air that comes from other people's lungs, which is kind of yuck, but only 1% to 2%, so that's good. But if you're not meeting code like Columbia Elementary, where it was 3,700 parts per million and climbing, then you're breathing more than 9% of every breath from other people's lungs. And I firmly doubt that anybody on the Board of Education would volunteer to huff directly out of the breathing zone air coming out of students' mouths and just go ahead and get sick. So
Right.
if we're wondering how sickness can happen, it's not like you need a public health degree. It's like if you're not adding fresh air and you're letting stale air accumulate and the kids are sitting together in a hot box, they're going to get more sick very likely.
Right. Yeah. And so the thing about it is like they can actually take action against this, right? I mean, there are things that can be done to prevent illness in this way and to recirculate air or to have fresh air basically, and to improve the indoor air quality that ultimately translates into less sickness, healthier people, less absence for kids, less absence for employees, like, right? There's stuff that can be done.
Exactly. Yeah, it really is. In the end, it's hitting everyone's pocketbooks. It's hitting your PTO balance when you have to take off work to take the kid to the doctor. If it does get to that point, you're sometimes taking off work because the kid just isn't sick enough to go to the doctor, but they need to stay home. And so you're at home with them for whatever reason. In some cases, just the child isn't attending school. That's harming academic performance. There are so many impacts to our productivity and to our academic excellence. I don't know why we would tolerate it when just meeting code would reduce that amount of rebreathed air, and that's a first step. Mechanical code, as adopted by the Division of Construction Management, says you should be giving kids at least 10 cubic feet per minute per kid of outdoor air or equivalent. And there are actually recommendations beyond that for putting kids back after the pandemic or during, really during it. CDC in 2020 said you ought to be giving about 18 or 20 CFM per person. And they define that in terms of carbon dioxide, but it's roughly 18 or 20 cubic feet per minute per person. The World Health Organization, 21 CFM per person. The Lancet said 30 CFM per person. There's a new standard from ESHRE. I've heard a lot of schools say, well, we implement ESHRE. And I think that they're talking about standard 62.1, which is essentially mechanical code. But there's a new standard, and that organization, by the way, said 62.1 ain't enough. And they also said, well, here's a new standard that would be enough, and it's 50 CFM per person. That's about 4 times what you require in mechanical code if you incorporate both the per person and the per unit area amount of code. So I'm getting real scientific here, but basically the recommendations are all give students way more than code. So if we're giving them way less than code, like 1/7 of code, we're doing the literal opposite of the recommendations. And I shouldn't be surprised if we find that students' chronic absenteeism figures go up, if we find that parents are consulting lawyers because of undue burden of doctor's notes, and that we find pylons in moms groups about the excessive illness. I don't think that that would be a surprise if I knew that we were doing that.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. And one thing is, you have approached school districts throughout North Alabama with ways to address this, including my understanding was that there was a grant run through UAB where HEPA filters were actually available for every classroom for basically any school that actually wanted them, any school that requested it. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's the ELC program. Basically, they used to be testing kids for COVID, and that kind of went out of style. People weren't interested in it or participating or whatever the case may be. And they said, well, we got to liquidate this money in a way that does aid public health. And they made the smart decision to say, well, we could buy portable HEPA filters, because what they knew is that portable HEPA filters can produce what's called equivalent outdoor air. And that just means it's equivalent in terms of not having contaminants in it to if you had brought in outdoor air. But you don't have to condition this air from these HEPA filters. It's just like installing a window in the middle of the room. But you can't reduce CO2 with that. Just a quick understanding, if filtration is used, it's not going to change this number, but it will clean the air. And so they gave these out to schools, first 5 at a time per school, then 15 at a time. And finally, they were just like, here, just take all the HEPA filters. Nobody's taking them. And there's one school I know of that I can't speak about the name of that school, but there's one school in Alabama that I know took 2 HEPA filters per classroom. And they're getting enough equivalent outdoor air in their classrooms on fan speed setting 2 of those HEPA filters, so that if their HVAC broke, they would still be meeting code. They would still be exceeding code if they have like a normal classroom occupancy. That's outstanding. So that means that if they are meeting code with their mechanical ventilation and they have these HEPA filters, they would be meeting some of the most aggressive recommendations we've heard of. And they just did it by doing something that was free. So Madison City Schools, I think they have them in a closet. They got maybe 15 per school. We let them know about that school that exercised the program for 2 per classroom, and Madison City Schools, as far as I can discern, did not opt in. Madison County Schools also, we can't tell that they did anything with that. It doesn't seem like they did. And their ventilation as well. I mean, I'm aware of some measurements there from faculty, and they're comparable to James Clemens, where we saw 6% rebreathed air rate. So that's about 3 times what you'd be breathing in from other people, or even 6 times as much as you'd be breathing in, depending on the size of the classroom, if you had met code. So none of it's really good. And I don't know why they're not doing these free things to just keep kids in class. It's not even like you have to keep those filters after that period of time. If those 2 years of filters run out and you didn't seem to do anything, just give them to the teachers or something.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it really does seem like a no-brainer. I mean, all of this is coming in the context of COVID, which did obviously increase risks for a lot of people. But I don't know anybody that loves getting sick. Just outside of the COVID context, I don't know anybody that loves that. And if you can reduce my chances of getting sick in the workplace, or my children getting sick at school and then bringing that home to me for free, I'm really going to be questioning why you're not doing that. What could possibly be the reason, other than, laziness, maliciousness, but it's so weird to think about that there would be school administrators that are, doing their hands like this, thinking about, oh, I can't wait to get all these parents sick. But that's the effect, right?
It is. So I know that there are concerns about having enough people, enough staff to go run around and change those filters. But I mean, nobody ever asked me if I would do it. I certainly would. I would go to all the schools and do that. And I know that I'm connected with parents who have volunteered to do similar kinds of efforts on a recurring basis. So there is not a lack of support for doing it. It's just that there's been a lack of willpower to do it, because I believe they underappreciate the connection between not giving students fresh air and then finding them getting sick. But if you didn't have a filter in a fish tank and you had a bunch of fish and they were breathing in all that yuck basically, and you didn't have any filter, they would die. So I'm not saying that that this is what's going to happen to kids, but I am saying it's common sense that if you live in an environment and you're there all the time, you need to have clean stuff to breathe. It's just kind of like common sense. So I think that parents need to call schools and each time their kid is sick with another virus and tell them, hey, you need to up your ventilation game and quit putting this on me and my kid. Don't tell me I need to get my kid in more often, and don't make me take time off work because of these issues. This is really on you. You had all the information. You had 3 years to do something. You had ESSER funds. You had the ELC program with free HEPA filters. You've made your decisions to spend it on learning loss in 2020, but you really need to do something now, because the learning loss that's happening right now is affecting my kids' grades in some cases.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So what can community members do? You mentioned that, and I think that's great. I mean, to start having those conversations with the schools, but what else can folks do if they're interested?
Yeah, one thing that they could do is come to the Madison Public Library on Wednesday, July 19th at 6:30. So just plugging for our event here, but we'll be in Auditorium 1 presenting. Thank you. Yeah, we'll be presenting how air quality relates to public health, and kind of just basically being able to attend work and school more often and just focus and do a great job at what we do and what we love to do. So we'll educate about what parents really need to be demanding in quantifiable terms, because that's one thing parents haven't had in the toolbox mostly. What exactly should I ask for, and how do I avoid getting hand waved away? How do I ask for something quantifiable so there can be a yes or no answer as to whether it's been done? Another thing is, and it's a privilege to be able to do this, but you could buy a CO2 monitor. You also could borrow one from us, Indoor Air Care Advocates. We've lent them out to various occupants of buildings who want to understand, and this is not just in schools, but just want to understand, well, am I getting adequate ventilation in the place where I work? Or are they hotboxing me with my office mates who are sneezing? And so I don't think any of it's about being afraid of a virus. I think it's about why are you causing me this undue stress and burden when I really I like to do my work. I'm great at it. I want to do it and I don't want to be sick. So why are you doing this to me? So getting a CO2 monitor is a way to do that. We're also trying to establish a CO2 monitor lending program at the library. We'll update on that at a later time. Cool. So those are two things you can do.
Absolutely.
Michael, before you go, we did have a question from the chat about the impact of school population to the size of the school. Is there a recommended square footage per child that would be acceptable, or is it just more about filtration and flow?
I don't have great figures. I will say that the American Industrial Hygiene Association has said that if you can't give kids at least 30 square feet per kid, so, multiply 20 kids by 30 and you get a 900 square foot room, right? If you can't give them that much space, they've indicated that you should be going towards about 12 air changes per hour rather than 6 air changes per hour. So there are recommendations I'm aware of that have that 30 square feet as a metric for going toward the higher end of ventilation recommendations. But I'm not an education expert per se, right? I'm just a dad who doesn't understand why we're not doing this. So I don't know what the proper amount of square footage is per kid. I do know that once you have adequate ventilation, if children are spaced out adequately, if the teacher to student ratio is okay and the room is big enough, then distancing, like we used to kind of pursue foolishly without ventilation, distancing actually does begin to matter, because the air that someone breathes out has a chance of getting sucked up or filtered or ventilated out instead of going into the next kid and getting them sick and maximizing illness. So certainly being farther apart does make a difference, but only when you've got ventilation. If you don't, that stuff is just going to cloud up and fill up in the room, and it doesn't matter that you had the kids far apart. So that's why I personally think it was foolish to pursue distancing without first making sure we had done something about ventilation and had the appropriate amount of fresh air coming in.
I see. That's and just in case you still weren't convinced by all the benefits that he's been talking about having all this improved air quality. Infinite Content in the chat says, if the air quality is better and more oxygen is in the air, students will be more focused. Casinos pump in oxygen to keep gamblers more awake and alert all the time. I didn't know that, but there we go. That's
William J. Fisk is a. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just, that's interesting. And yeah, I appreciate that, Infinite Content.
William J. Fisk is a Lawrence Berkeley scholar or academic rather, who published a review of many, many, many kinds of literature. And they all said the same thing. As you give kids more ventilation and fresh air, their cognitive performance and even their grade point averages and test scores increase. And so there's no downside to free, fresh air. So we're just hoping that the schools that have still got ESSER money that they've failed to be able to allocate to the things they thought they would might be able to change course. The ARPA Act actually sets forth that you must update your plan every 6 months, and you are free to update it in light of any facts that you come into contact with that may change your course. And so all schools have an option, if they have yet to spend those committed funds, have an option to rebudget that and spend it on something that's going to make a difference in terms of the current learning loss that they're experiencing. I just think that it's difficult to get them to believe that there's a connection or that there is a problem, even though parents are seeming to complain about it. So that's more parents need to get together and acknowledge the problem and know that there are solutions. That we don't have to just complain. We really have something we should have expected.
Right. Last thing, Michael, remind us about your article that was published in Salon recently.
Yeah, I co-authored this with a co-founder of Protect Their Future. And we just wrote about how, there are so many air quality scientists and aerosol scientists and HVAC engineers and professionals, industrial hygienists, et cetera, who are saying, hey, this is a thing. You can actually enjoy that normalcy that we were kind of guaranteed and promised.
And I should add, the nurses unions, in particular in the UK, have also been very vocal on this issue.
Yeah, unions in the UK have actually put together ventilation guides. And so I think they're really on top of understanding like what their working conditions ought to be if they're expected to be at work and attending and all that stuff. So I certainly think it would be valuable, kind of tying into your show, right? For unions to understand kind of the new currency at the cash register of health, of public health. And that new currency is equivalent outdoor air. And we stand ready to really tell anybody who is interested. We have spoken to homeless shelters. We have spoken to people who work in government buildings. It's just anybody who wants to understand the connection between public health and outdoor air and the science and recommendations. We would absolutely love to share with you what we've put together, which is all based on what the experts are putting forth. And we think that helps people understand what they should be expecting, demanding, asking for, etc.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.